The most dangerous American on this ridge in Belgium is lying flat in the snow, and he is not holding a rifle. More dangerous than the tank crews behind him, more dangerous than the machine gunners dug in along the tree line. This quiet man with cold hands and a grease pencil, a radio, a map, and a pair of binoculars, whispering numbers into a handset. Because when he finishes speaking, and he lifts his thumb off that radio, the ground where he is looking is going to be torn open by the guns of an entire army corps, all at once, with no warning at all. The German soldiers coming up that slope have been told a great many things about the Americans. That they are soft, that they are amateurs who will fold at the first hard push. Some of that, the Germans will find out, is not entirely wrong. The Americans made mistakes on the Western Front that a veteran army would not have made. They paid for those mistakes in ground and in men. And the Germans facing them in the winter of 1944 were, many of them, hard professionals who had already survived years on the Eastern Front where they had seen the worst that war had to offer, and had come home from it. They did not scare easily. But there is one thing the men in Field Grey have learned across France and now here in the Ardennes, and it is the thing they will still be talking about 50 years later in kitchens and veterans' halls long after the tanks are scrap. Ask a German infantryman who survived the Western Front what he feared most, and he will not say the Sherman. He will not say the fighter-bomber overhead. He will lower his voice, and he will tell you it was the American artillery. And then he will try to explain why, and he will find that he cannot quite. The words do not hold the thing. This is the story of the weapon the Germans could not fight back against and could not escape. It was not a better gun. It was something stranger than that, and harder to see. And that is exactly why it worked. It is the reason a lieutenant with a radio was worth more on that ridge than every tank in the valley. Let's be honest about one thing first, because it matters, and because if I get it wrong, the whole story falls apart. The Germans were not fools about artillery. They practically invented modern gunnery. Their guns were good. Their rocket launchers, the Nebelwerfers, the ones the Americans called screaming memes, for the sound they made coming in, were genuinely terrifying, and any American who tells you otherwise was not there. If this were a story about who could build the finer cannon, it would be a much closer contest than you have been led to believe. In some ways, the Germans would win it, but that is not what won and lost men on the Western Front. The difference was never really the gun sitting in the field. It was everything behind the gun. It came down to a single question, and the question was this. From the moment an American observer laid eyes on a target, how long did it take for the shells to arrive, and how many of them could he bring down on that one spot at the same moment? For the Germans, the answer was slow. Their artillery was a thing of preparation. Surveyors plotted the guns and the targets carefully onto maps in advance. Fire was arranged like a railway timetable, planned the night before, laid out in sequence. It worked, and it worked well, when the battle went the way the plan said it would. But when something appeared that the plan had not foreseen, a column caught on a road, infantry suddenly in the open where they should not have been, the German gunners had to stop and work the problem by hand, and the working took time. And time is the one thing a target in the open will never give you. By the time the German solution was ready, the target had usually walked away. The Americans had built something else. They had built a nervous system and dropped it over the whole battlefield. At the center of it was a room, or sometimes just a truck, or a hole in the frozen ground, and they called it the Fire Direction Center. The entire purpose of that center was to collapse time. A single forward observer, one man with a radio like the one on that ridge, could see a target, call back a rough position in plain speech, and the men inside that center would do the mathematics for every gun in the battalion at once, on standardized firing tables they had drilled on until it was reflex. Not one gun ranging in, shot by shot, walking its way onto the target while the enemies scattered into cover. Every gun in the battalion, together, on the first volley. A German soldier who saw the first ranging shot land had a few seconds to run. A German soldier under an American fire mission did not see a first shot. He saw all of them. And it reached further than the battalion. That is the part that broke men. The Americans had a procedure they called a serenade. A soft, almost tender word for what it actually did. A single forward observer, one lieutenant lying in the snow with cracked lips and a numb hand on a radio, could ask not only for his own battalion's guns, but for the guns of the whole division, the whole corps, every barrel within range, dozens of them, scattered across miles of frozen Belgian country, batteries that had never seen each other, all of them swinging to point at one patch of ground that one cold man had chosen off a map. It took a senior commander's word to release it, and it was run entirely by radio. No survey, no timetable, just a voice, and then the world ending somewhere a mile away, wherever the voice had pointed. And here is the detail the Germans found impossible to put into words afterward. When those shells came, they did not arrive one after another, in a rhythm you could count. They did not walk toward you, giving you the chance to time a run to the next hole between them. They arrived at the same instant, all of them, everywhere. The Americans called it time on target. Each battery, each individual gun, sat at a different distance from where the shells were meant to land. So each one fired at a different moment. Every firing time calculated so that every shell from every gun, no matter how far it had to fly, crossed the finish line together. The first thing you heard was also the last thing you heard. There was no whistle to warn you, because the whistle and the impact came at once. There was no ranging round to throw you into your hole in time. The sky simply opened, all across your position, in a single breath. Try to imagine what that does to a man's mind. Not his body, his mind, over weeks, over months. You cannot hear it coming, so you can never relax, not while eating, not while sleeping, not ever. You cannot fight back at it because there is nothing in front of you to shoot at. You cannot even be brave against it, and this is the cruelest part, because courage is a thing you spend on an enemy you can see. This was just the air, deciding without notice that your corner of the field was finished, and finishing it. I want to stop here for one moment, because this is the part that is easiest to get wrong, and I would honestly rather you catch me than let it slide. It would be very simple to turn this into a story about American machines being better, and to leave it there, and to feel good about it. That is not the story, and it is not true. There is a photograph coming up in a moment of a forward observer with his radio, an ordinary young man, and I want you to actually stop and look at his face when it appears, because everything I am describing ran through men exactly like him. The technology only mattered because of where it put the decision. It took the power of 1,000 guns, and it placed that power in the hands of one cold, frightened man who was close enough to the enemy to see their faces. That was the American invention. Not the shell, the trust. Hold on to that, because we are going to come back to what it cost the man who carried it. Now, in spite of everything I have said, there was still, for most of the war, one place a German soldier could go to survive American artillery. And in the winter of 1944, the Americans quietly took that away too. For years, artillery killed by fragments and by blast, and both of those could be cheated if you were quick and, if you were lucky, by getting below the surface of the earth. A slit trench, a foxhole, a cellar under a farmhouse. The shell burst on the ground and the ground itself caught most of what it threw sideways, and the man curled at the bottom of his hole had a real chance to live. Every soldier on every side of that war knew this in his bones. The earth was the last friend you had left when everything else failed. Then the Americans brought out something they had been guarding like a state secret, because it was one. A fuse. A small device screwed into the nose of an ordinary shell with a tiny radio transmitter sealed inside it. As the shell fell, that little radio listened for the echo of the ground rushing up to meet it, and at a set height, 50 feet up, 40, 20, it triggered the shell while it was still in the air, above the men's heads. They called it the proximity fuse, or the VT fuse, and the American High Command had been so afraid of it, so afraid of a dud falling into German hands and the enemy copying the idea and turning it against Allied bombers, that for a long time they forbade its use over land entirely. It took Eisenhower himself, pushing hard, to get it released for the ground war at all. And when it was released, it came to the Ardennes in that same iron December. Understand exactly what it did. A shell that bursts in the air, above a foxhole, does not have its fragments caught by the earth, because the earth is now below it. Everything the shell throws, it throws downward, into the hole, onto the men who had done the one thing that had always saved them. Near a town called Echternach, on the nights the Americans first used these fuses against troops, one American general recorded 700 German soldiers killed. The ground had stopped being a friend. For the first time in the war, there was no longer anywhere on the whole battlefield a man could put his body where the artillery could not reach in and find it. And all of it, the nervous system and the serenade and the shells that met in the air over one point and the ones that burst above the hole, all of it came together in one place, on one low ridge, in those same December weeks. And if you want to understand why the German soldier feared this weapon above the tank, above everything, you only need to understand what happened there. The place was called Elsenborn Ridge. In the middle of December 1944, Germany threw the last real strength it had into the snow-covered Ardennes, gambling everything on one lunge for the river Meuse and the port beyond it. It was the attack we remember now as the Battle of the Bulge. The northern shoulder of that offensive, the hinge the whole thing swung on, ran straight into a low rise held by two American infantry divisions, the 99th and the 2nd. The Germans needed the roads that ran behind that ridge, and they needed them in the first hours, or the timetable for the entire offensive would come apart. There were 4 roads they had to have. This ridge sat astride 2 of them, and the Germans opened the way the Germans always opened, with their own artillery. A barrage of 90 minutes, heavy guns, and the screaming rocket launchers throwing everything they had onto the American line. They even switched on searchlights and bounced the beams off the low winter cloud to make a kind of pale artificial moonlight to attack by. On paper, it should have shattered the defenders. It did almost nothing. Because the American infantry on that ridge had dug in, and then they had done the patient, miserable, freezing work of felling trees and roofing their holes over with logs and earth, so that when the German fire came down, it came down onto timber and frozen dirt, and the men underneath lived through it. The great German bombardment, the one meant to break the line open, passed over the heads of soldiers who were already thinking past it to what they knew was coming next. And what came next was the answer. And the answer is the whole point of this story. Over the days that followed, the American guns massed behind Elsenborn Ridge fired and did not stop. There was no shortage of shells, and that mattered, because a weapon that terrifies you is far worse when it never has to rest. On one day alone, the 22nd of December, The American artillery put close to 10,000 rounds into the German attacks on that single stretch of front. Not scattered across the line to keep everyone's head down. Concentrated, again and again, called down by the observers wherever they saw men and vehicles trying to come forward. Some German tanks, a handful, actually punched through and reached the American positions. But the infantry that was supposed to come in behind those tanks, the ordinary foot soldiers who were meant to walk in and take the ground and hold it, that infantry was being torn apart in the open snow before it ever arrived. By the accounts of the men who held that ridge, not a single German foot soldier reached the American foxholes. Sit with the shape of that for a second. The German artillery opened the battle and accomplished almost nothing, because the Americans were under their logs. The American artillery answered, and it stopped an entire army corps stone dead, because the Germans were in the open, and there is no roof a man can carry with him across a field. So picture one of those German infantrymen, because he is the whole reason we are here. He has survived his own side's opening barrage, which told him the great attack was finally on. He climbs up out of his start position. The guns of his own army fall silent now because it is his turn to go forward, and you do not drop shells onto the ground your own men are about to walk across. To him, that silence is the signal. It means advance. So he advances out into a wide white field, with tanks somewhere ahead of him in the smoke and the half-light, doing the thing he has been trained his whole soldier's life to do. And then the sky, which has told him nothing, comes apart above his head. He cannot hear where it began, because it did not begin anywhere and walk to him. It simply arrived, complete, over all of them at once. He cannot get low enough, because it is bursting above him now, not on the ground beside him, and low is no longer a direction that helps. He cannot shoot back because the men killing him are a mile away, or two, and he will never see even one of them. And one of those men is a lieutenant with a grease pencil and a radio, who watched him step out into that field and set a few flat numbers into a handset and then went back to watching the next stretch of snow. That is the thing the German soldier could never explain afterward to the people at home who had not stood in that field. It was not the violence of it. War is violence, and he knew that already. It was the helplessness of it. There was nothing to be brave against. There was no one to charge, no gun to silence, no flank to work around. There was only the arithmetic and the radio and the certainty that his own life was being decided by a stranger he would never lay eyes on. And that, in the end, is why this weapon hollowed men out in a way the tanks never did. You can fight a tank. Men found ways, terrible and desperate ways, but real ways, to fight tanks. And there is a strange kind of courage available to a man who at least has something in front of him to attack. You can fight another man with a rifle, but you cannot fight a phone call. You cannot flank a radio net. You cannot outrun a number written on a map in a truck 2 miles behind the line. And a soldier who comes to understand this, deep down where his nerve lives, who comes to believe that his skill and his training and his cover simply do not matter, that whether he lives through the next 10 minutes is out of his hands entirely, that soldier is half beaten before the next attack even begins. The American artillery did not only kill Germans, it quietly took something out of the ones it left alive, and a lot of them never got it back. We do not remember the war this way, and I understand why. We remember it by the machines that had names: the Tiger, the Sherman, the Spitfire. We roll the tanks into the museums, and we should, and children walk around them and lay their hands on the cold steel and feel close to the thing. But the weapon that did the most killing on the Western Front, the one the men on the receiving end feared past any tank, has no shape you can stand next to in a museum. It was a method. It was mathematics done fast in a freezing truck. It was a radio net stretched invisibly across a snowfield. It was, at the bottom of it, one decision, made over and over, to hand a single frightened young man the strength of 1,000 others, and to trust him to aim it well. And it was the men who served those guns, and the men who lay out ahead of them in the snow and watched, whose names almost nobody alive can tell you. They did not ride anything into battle that anyone thought to photograph. They were the reason the riflemen lived and the enemy did not. And when the war was finally remembered, the remembering went to the tanks, and it went past them. So I am going to ask you for one thing at the end of this one, and it is a small thing. Somewhere back in your family, there may be a man who was one of them. Not a tanker, not a fighter pilot, a gunner on a howitzer crew, feeding shells into a hot barrel until his hands shook and his ears rang for days. A forward observer who crawled out ahead of the line with a radio and a map and nothing else. A man in a fire directions center doing the arithmetic in the dark that put the shells exactly where they had to go. A wireman who ran telephone cable across open ground so the numbers could travel when the radios failed. These men did not come home with stories that fit onto a screen. If you had one, put his name down below this video. His name, and the outfit he served with if you know it, the battalion, the division, the guns he worked on. Do not put it there for me. Put it there so that it stops being invisible, the way the whole thing was invisible, the way it has stayed invisible for 80 years now. One name at a time, in the comments under this video, we can start to keep a record of the men who did the quiet killing that kept the visible men alive. The tanks got the museums. The very least we can do for these men is give them the comments. The German soldier who survived that ridge went home, and he spent the rest of his life trying to describe a weapon he had never once seen. He never managed it. He only knew that it had found him wherever he went, and that no amount of courage he could summon had ever answered it. It was not the tank. It was never the tank. It was a man with a radio, and everything patient and unglamorous standing in the snow behind him. And it is long past time we knew his name.